All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Doug, can you hear me okay? Great. Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, everyone, depending on your location. My name is Audrey Mossberger, and I'm the Senior Director of Events and Development at the National Bureau of Asian Research. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's virtual launch event, hosted by NBR and the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security, marking the release of the report, China's Digital Ambitions, a Global Strategy to Supplant the Liberal Order. Following each of today's panels, we'll open things up to audience Q&A. For those joining us here on WebEx and via live stream, please email your questions to events@nbr.org. We encourage you to send those in prior to Q&A, as you might find that your question is addressed during the discussion. If not, our moderators will do their very best to present all questions to our panelists within our allotted time. Finally, for those interested in downloading a copy of the report, you can do so easily by clicking on the link that we will soon put in the chat box. Well, we have an expert lineup of speakers who are ready to go, and so with that, I will turn things over to NBR's Vice President of Research, Ali Zielinski. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Audrey. Sorry, I didn't get my video turned on quickly enough there. Hi, everybody. Welcome. And again, thanks for joining us. It's my pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm going to turn it over to our counterpart, our co-host organization here for today's event, and just do a quick introduction of the speaker here. Jun Koo Yu is a research professor at the Center for International Law at Korea National Diplomat Academy, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and concurrently serves as a visiting professor at Sungkyunkwan University. He has served on advisory committees for the Ministry of Science, Information Technology, the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy, and the Defense Acquisition Program Agency. Dr. Yu currently specializes in international public domain laws, focusing on cyberspace and outer space, and has served as a chief legal advisor for the 5th United Nations Group of Governmental Experts. He also served as deputy director of the Presidential Committee for the G20 Seoul Summit. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Yu for some opening remarks before we turn over to some of the report presentation here today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. And then I also really appreciate Mr. Doug and then Audrey to organize this meaningful event. And then actually we were intended to hold this meeting in Seoul, but due to the severe COVID situation in Korea. So now that's very much disappointed, but I hope to hold this event one more time if we have a chance. And also I really thank for all the panelists and then to join this event, and then they have very much expert in this topic. And then nowadays, as you can see, the Chinese new digital policy influence a lot, not only for the competing state, but also some very much civil society also. And then this issue is big, very much controversial in global governance relating to the digital challenge, digital issue. And also our government and then all the relevant stakeholder are very much interested in this issue and how we're gonna organize and then how we're gonna respond on the Chinese and global policy and strategy. And also we maybe have to build a very meaningful, important partnership, not only US and then but also any other like-minded countries. So this is my general remark on this event. And then during our event and then seminar, we can have a important some idea and then share the information. This will be great chance to build up the partnership between the IFAN and then MBR. Thank you. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Junku. Hi, everyone. I'm Doug Strube, Assistant Director with NBR's Center for Innovation, Trade, and Strategy, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Emily de la Bruyere. Emily is a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research and co-founder of Horizon Advisory, a consulting firm focusing on the implications of China's competitive approach to geopolitics. She has extensive Chinese language research experience, and her work is at the cutting edge of analysis on China's military-civil fusion strategy and platform geopolitics, as well as their implications for global security and the economic order. She was the principal investigator for this project and authored both the introductory chapter of the report, which lays out the overarching argument of what China's digital strategy is and what objectives it seeks to achieve, as well as the third chapter, which examines China's efforts to shape international technical standards. I think my colleague Jonathan has put the link to the report in the chat, and there's also an interactive data tool that he will provide the link to as well. And with that, I'll pass it over to Emily to present the report's main findings. Thanks for joining, Emily.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you everyone for joining this evening. I'll try to keep it brief, and I want to begin with a summary of the report, what we are seeking to accomplish, and then the overall arguments that we present. The goal with this project is to outline relatively comprehensively China's digital ambitions and their implications for the world order. We begin with what it is that China is trying to accomplish, with Beijing's calculus that the emergence of data as a factor of production is catalyzing a new industrial revolution, the digital revolution, and that this digital revolution offers Beijing a chance not just to rise within the existing international system, but rather to challenge it, to rewrite its rules, to rewrite its systems, and to create a global architecture that serves China's interests and favors China as well as Chinese players at the expense of other international counterparts. Beijing's calculus within this framework is that in the digital revolution, if China can control data, it can control the global order. This idea of controlling data begins with an effort to access superior information. So to ensure that Beijing has more and better data than other global players. But China's vision of controlling data doesn't end there. It also includes an effort to shape information and its flow, to determine how, where, and what information moves to whom and at what pace. Because if China can do that, it can shape the virtual as well as the physical environments, and by extension can establish an advantage for itself in economic, in informational, in military, and political domains. What does this mean more concretely? If China succeeds in this ambition, it would be able, for example, better to target and to define its propaganda and disinformation. It would be able to shape the information environment in which recipients of that information existed. More commercially, China would be able to feed its commercial champions superior market information, giving them a leg up, but it would also be able to determine the environment in which market quote-unquote competition took place, whether that meant shaping supply chains with information systems or targeting the proclivities of consumers so that they were more inclined to consume Chinese goods. And then militarily is a similar dynamic. Beijing's effort would grant the People's Liberation Army superior information on the battlefield, but also the ability to distort or undermine the information of the adversary. In other words, across just about every dimension, Beijing's effort would lock in not only advantage for itself, but also effectively the inability to operate should Beijing choose to leverage its power of adversaries or competitors. How does China accomplish this? In the report, we map it out along 4 primary mutually reinforcing steps. The first is China's effort to build digital infrastructure, physical systems like data centers, like telecommunications, like satellites, that give China footholds into information flows and also footholds into the digital industrial systems that undergird the digital environment. The second step, relatedly, is building out the virtual infrastructures of the physical world, of the digital world, namely digital platforms like social media, like payment platforms, like innovation platforms, even, for example, logistics softwares. This lets China shape the not only information flows, but also the relationship between users and the digital environment. Those are both relatively bottom-up efforts. China complements them with a more top-down approach that seeks to shape digital technical standards as well as digital governance systems to lock in advantage for Chinese players, whether that's the Chinese government or Chinese commercial actors. Throughout, Beijing benefits from a set of asymmetric structural advantages that might be uniquely determinative in this present digital competition. Those include China's size, its centralization, and its industrial capacity. China's size is such that its networks and its platforms are bigger than those of other international competitors. And in this dynamic, because those can offer more connections, bigger tends to mean better. In addition, China's centralization means that it can actually marshal its scale in a way that other players can't. For example, when China sends representatives to international standards organizations, those representatives are operating according to the strategic ambitions of the Chinese state. Therefore, they vote as a bloc, and therefore they have more power than might other players who are more fragmented, operating in their own commercial interests. Finally, China's industrial capacity lets it influence the international private sector. It also gives China the toolkit necessary to build out the digital infrastructures, as well as their value chains that are necessary to its overall strategy. Because this structural advantage on China's part creates an enormous challenge, as does the strategic agenda guiding China's actions. And to our minds, it demands, at a very first order, multilateral cooperation and response. It creates a challenge that no individual player can respond to alone, and that threatens to undermine the prosperity, the security, and the freedom of every other global actor. And with that, I will cede my time to any questions or to the next portion of the program.
Thanks, Emily. So a reminder, as Audrey had mentioned, audience members, please feel free to welcome or send your questions in via email. And I will kick it off in the meantime. So yeah, Emily, I had a question regarding your comments and the report overall. A big part of this is how China gains influence by building digital infrastructure and sort of expanding into developing markets a lot of times. So how does this play out in a country like Korea that already has solid digital infrastructure and data governance in place? Is China's digital strategy as effective in a place like this?
Thank you. China targets different parts of its digital strategy to different countries, with the goal both of exerting influence and obtaining resources. So, for example, China's proliferation of digital platforms, whether that's social media or payment systems, is targeted at both very developed digital systems and more emerging ones, in a way that infrastructure efforts might not be in places that already have sophisticated digital infrastructure. So it plays out differently. It certainly plays out. One other beat that's really critical is that China's entire digital strategy hinges on obtaining and leveraging resources that are acquired elsewhere, and especially in advanced economies and technological ecosystems. So Beijing uses partnership with countries like Korea to obtain technology, but also an example in the standards domain to get buy-in for its technical standards that it's seeking to export internationally. This gives China a springboard, both in terms of actual technological and scientific sophistication, but also in terms of leverage over an international system. And China is able to do this because it pursues these partnerships with a very with a strategic coordinated vision, whereas other players in the international system tend to be driven by actual cooperative goals.
Thanks. Junko, you had mentioned you might be
Yeah, so
open
adding
to.
to Audrey's comment, I think this is one of the top priority to build up the digital infra and platform, particularly in the Eastern Asian country, as you mentioned, that combined with the satellite and the outer space technology, they maybe set up and installed lots of digital infra in Eastern Asian country, maybe some part in the Latin American countries. So this is a big issue to in Korea also. Almost all of the digital infra already installed by the China. There is not much room for even Japan and Korea to begin the business in the digital platform. So that's my general comment on this issue. And also, so my question to you, so are there any some policy option to respond on the Chinese very eager activity in building up the digital infra in Eastern Asia, the maybe in terms of Indo-Pacific strategies. So do you have any comment on this issue?
Thank you for that framing and for underlining those points. At the risk of stealing the thunder of the second panel, which is going to focus, I believe, on policy solutions, we lay out in this report a set of, or a taxonomy for policy recommendations. Among the core priorities are, first of all, just actually leveraging and more effectively leveraging for multilateral cooperation. So because the international system is not going to be able to achieve the centralization of Beijing's approach. But much of the current failure to respond to China's digital strategy lies in a failure to pursue somewhat unified goals and defensive as well as proactive measures. So if there can be alignment among allies and partners on, for example, what constitutes a positive digital governance system, but also which value chains are necessary to be bolstered, and by which players at what nodes within them. What digital infrastructures are the priority? Which ones are most at risk? Same for platforms. Answering those broad questions means that then incentives can be shaped and actions can be aligned in a way that doesn't require constant deliberation on acting in lockstep. It's agreeing on an overall framework and then pursuing it relatively independently, which would be a much more effective way of responding and also a feasible one. So I think that's the high level approach for a response as we see it. And then the core buckets that would fall into are, first of all, shared information on the digital environment, supply chains, infrastructure system, but also governance and standards. Shared prioritization of rebuilding industrial capacity in terms of manufacturing, also in terms of building infrastructure, but also in terms of a more modern twist on industrial capacity, which lies in, for example, scaling digital platforms, but also agreement and coordinated action in the higher level architectural system. So digital governance and corresponding regulations, but also technical standards at a grittier, more corporate level, to be very high level and brief on policy suggestions.
Thank you. So we have several questions coming in from the audience. Too many to get to, actually, I'm sure. But Emily, you might have some thoughts on this, given that you also wrote a chapter on standard setting. Someone is asking about China promoting new IP in the ITU, and just asking if you have any insight into how this is progressing, and if there's any developments in that area.
I think this might not be a precise answer to this question, but the new IP effort has gotten a lot of I think there's been a failure to take what China's doing seriously, because this particular effort seems like it's unlikely to pan out in the immediate term or as it currently exists. But I think the framework with which I look at this question is one very much like the framework with which I look at China's standardization efforts more broadly. Beijing starts with a relatively weak hand of cards in terms of the standards it's proposing, if you look like longitudinally over time, and tries for it and shoots its shot. And then this keeps happening, and the efforts get more sophisticated. The amount of support China has gets greater. The players who are advancing its standards acquire more leverage, and ultimately you get to a point where China does have influence in the standards area it's targeting, or in standards more broadly. I think with new IP, we're still at a relatively early stage in this process. But the fact that China is advertising it at a high level suggests a lot about what China's ambitions are, what it wants to message about its goals, and also where it wants to be in a few years.
Great, thanks. So we just have a couple minutes left. Actually, Junku, I have a question for you about the new presidential administration coming in. You had mentioned before this event that President Yoon has a strong focus on digital issues. Could you just talk about how you think this is going to impact China-Korea digital relations? If he's going to take a new approach to that?
I think current let me maybe trace back to the 5G issue, Huawei issue. I think this is big. This was very big impact to the Korean industry and then government policy. After that, we maybe step by step try to adjust new digital maybe environment. So particularly in the depending on the government maybe characteristic, but nowadays there's not much possibility chance to cooperate with China, particularly there may be strategy to influence in the particularly in the Eastern Asian country. So basically the upcoming government maybe international cooperation itself maybe to build up the cooperation among the like-minded country, and also we but anyway we have to carefully adjust and then think about the Chinese global digital strategy, because basically that strategy not much give a positive impact to Korea. So there is maybe two big issue. One of the maybe set up the global governance, and then second issue try to build up the data transfer issue, and then to maybe to adjust the digital transformation issue. So my point is in upcoming government in maybe in beginning the stage to check up all the possibility and the policy option to reflecting to the general global digital platform and environment. And then we're gonna set up the new policy agenda and then roadmap within 1 year to what kinds of sector maybe we're gonna focus on, because we have to maybe choose and then concentrate in the digital platform issue. So I think in the 6G and then satellite infrastructure, one of the key pillar for upcoming new the government. There is two big pillar for, particularly in terms of infrastructure.
Great. Well, thank you both. Unfortunately, we have to move on to the next panel. There's still a lot of questions pending, so thank you to the audience for submitting these questions, and we'll try to get them in if they're appropriate in the next couple panels here. So with that, I will introduce the speakers for the first panel. We have Karen Sutter joining us. She is a specialist in Asian trade and finance at the Congressional Research Service, and she previously worked at the U.S. Department of Treasury, the CIA, the U.S. China Business Council, and the Atlantic Council, and has over 30 years of experience working on U.S.-Asia policy issues and cross-cutting economic, political, technological, and national security issues in government, business, and the think tank community. She will be joined by Hyo-Young Lee, an assistant professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, and she teaches international trade and diplomacy. Previously, she worked as a research fellow at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy and as assistant secretary for trade, industry, and energy at the presidential office. Her research focuses on a range of international trade and digital trade issues and includes a recent report on the evolution and evaluation of international rules of digital trade. Dr. Lee received her PhD in international studies from Seoul National University, majoring in international trade law and policy. With that, I'll turn it over to Karen to speak first.
Thank you so much, Doug. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's a great honor to be with you all this evening, Washington time evening. And it was a really great pleasure to be part of this NBR project. I just want to mention that the views in the report itself and the things I'm going to talk about tonight are my personal views. They don't represent Congressional Research Service or the Library of Congress, my current employer. In my chapter in research, I looked at China's digital platform strategy, as Emily was talking about earlier, kind of the soft connective tissue in what China's building out in its architecture. And I looked at a variety of different types of platforms. So transaction in the sense of trade, payments, retail, information in the sense of messaging, social media, media, super apps like WeChat, industrial and innovation platforms, which I actually found the most interesting and perhaps received the least amount of attention and a lot of writing, infrastructure, and also enterprise software. So Emily mentioned earlier about logistics. We've seen some attention to this in China's use of certain apps in the shipping industry. I also looked at it in the sense of the hotel business industry, back office platforms that interface for business and customers. And then in the case studies, I looked at Alibaba's e-world trade platform, PBOC's efforts for a central digital currency, Smart Grid's efforts at global cross-border information sharing and trade and renewable energy. And again, these industrial innovation platforms. So China Aerospace, CASIC's work, especially with partners in Germany and other parts of Europe. And then the competitor to Microsoft's GitHub, Gitty. So just to give you a flavor of what I looked at, I'd like to raise 6 considerations for you. These were my personal takeaways in the research and writing that I did, and just to provoke thought and discussion, I hope. The first point is just the extent of the power of the state in what China's doing in digital platforms. I think when you look domestically at what China's doing, if you look at the surveillance systems for the Uyghurs, if you look at what China did during COVID and monitoring movement of people, if you look at smart cities and what China's done domestically, there's a strong appreciation in the writing of what the state is doing, and both, corporate alignment with state interests and projects and objectives, and also the state, we see it increasingly inserting its role in the digital platforms in China. We've seen this over the past year and a half. It's been quite pronounced. We don't seem to translate this when these same companies and corporate actors go offshore. And so, I just think that role of the state is very, very powerful as far as the touch points that China has, that the Chinese government has and could have with regard to these digital platforms. And I also talk about in the chapter that China uses certain terms that we often think are the same, but they use them very differently because of the role of the state. And so thinking of antitrust competition policy that China's enforcing on its platforms, the role of privacy, and this idea of open systems. it's not really in the way that we think about it, individual rights. It's much more in the sense of breaking down barriers to promote innovation and access for the state. And so I just want to mention that as kind of the first core takeaway. The second point is related, and it's basically the idea that China has this state vision and state plans of what it's trying to do in digital architecture, digital services. But it uses these corporate actors to implement its policies, both domestically and overseas. But when these corporate actors arrive in foreign markets, other governments, other systems treat them as pure companies. And so I think this raises questions about, how these companies operate. Are there potential sensitive touch points? Are the current efforts at mitigation adequate? Are they sufficient? And just kind of, I think it's easy for other systems to miss in small case-by-case activities, corporate activities, a broader play that China may be doing as far as moving into other markets. The third point is something that seems very obvious. It's something we talked a lot about with regard to China in the 1990s, but we don't say this word very much anymore, and I'd like to reintroduce it to the top of people's list. And it's this issue of reciprocity and this asymmetry in market access. And it's understood, it's well known, but I think, in looking at digital platforms and the research I did, it's really fundamental to China's success. In a couple of ways. So China's ability to wall off its market to foreign competition. As Emily was saying earlier, the size and scale of China's market, if foreign competitors cannot compete on equal terms or at all in that same market, that gives Chinese companies a huge advantage before they even leave China. And yet China's moving into this space in ways that are not very well regulated or controlled, and they're very open to Chinese participants. And so they're moving quite quickly into foreign markets while they're staying restricted domestically. And I think this is really fundamental to how they've been able to be so successful. The other thing in that regard I would highlight that I don't think is well understood is China is right now developing what looks like an open trade posture. If you see that they're trying to join different regional trade groupings in Asia, DCEP, they joined RCEP, they're interested in CPTPP. China benefits from being closed while other markets are open to China. But most importantly, if you look at what they're doing in digital platforms, they want barriers in third markets to come down to one another so they can capitalize on scale. So for example, State Grid, would benefit if energy barriers came down in North America between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, or in Southeast Asia. If some of those national barriers came down, then China could come in over top. And so I think that's part of the reason they have this open posture. So just to mention that. The fourth area I just want to mention briefly is this power and risks of convergence. And convergence is a term that means a lot of different things to people. I use it in three different ways. One is this issue of platform integration and service integration, concentration. So if the state has access and control and touch points behind each commercial operator in ways that are not the same as in market-oriented economies, there's a lot of both front visible convergence as platforms come together, but there's also a lot of potential back office convergence. And this becomes even more powerful with China's control of the internet and digital architecture more broadly, the use of a true ID, the ability to link all these things, I think becomes very powerful. And then the final point on convergence is something I mentioned at the very beginning of my chapter, but if you look at what China is trying to do in One Belt, One Road, Digital Silk Road, if you look at their national technology policies, if you look at their foreign policies, if you look at their economic policies, digital platforms is a place where this can all come together. And so this broader centralization and digitalization of all kinds of services, not just in China, but globally, I think they're poised to really benefit from this potentially the way they're playing. And so I think this convergence can be very, very powerful, and it can give China a lot of central control and potential vertical integration through these platforms as something to think about. The fifth point is that China is a latecomer to digital platforms. There are, other very dominant leaders in this space, but I think it's easy to dismiss that they won't be as successful or they'll be a second-tier player. But I think there's a risk of underestimating what might happen. And so I've just raised a couple of points here. One is that China is definitely using first mover advantage. And so they're using this in a couple of ways. They're deliberately looking at new emerging technologies like blockchain. Blockchain is developed by the government that's being deployed in a variety of different applications, including central bank currency. They're looking at breaking into new markets. So they're capitalizing, for example, if you look at State Grid's efforts, they're looking at renewable energy. So this idea of coming on top of existing grids with being able to overlay with new energy. And I think, fundamentally, new technologies are disruptive. And so what's very powerful here is if you look at where China's using digital platforms to break into, these are the most protected sectors in an economy that are traditionally considered critical infrastructure, protected, secured. So media, financial services, health, government services, all these areas are where they're able to break in. And let me just finish up here. I would say the other thing to keep in mind, there was the question earlier about how would China be in a developed market that already has a lot of digital infrastructure like Korea versus other markets that have less infrastructure. I think sometimes it's easy to miss what China's doing because in a lot of developed markets, they ride the existing infrastructure. They come in and they're on the operating system for Android or Apple, or they're on, Amazon Web Cloud, or, and so they participate, but they basically, and you see this in a host of sectors, they're basically doing it simultaneously, where they're developing their own infrastructure and platform at the same time that they're riding the existing platform and architecture in a particular country. And so just in closing, there was a question asked to Emily earlier of what do we do? I think what's also striking to me in closing is that this is a lot of areas where foreign governments control the space. For many countries, the underlying technologies, services are things that China has obtained through acquisition or licensing or open platforms. And so this issue of, they have gaps in what they need to be able to operate the platforms. It's the setting terms of being in the market, both as a platform and, as I mentioned, the services that they're breaking into. And I think it does raise a question, if China has a very different model, if China's playing a very different game here, should China be treated the same? China is very much trying to normalize a status model. Should a status model be treated like every other model? Is it a company, and at what point is it the state as you're dealing with some of these platforms, given what we're seeing in all the state touch points? So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And over to you, Hyo-young.
Thank you for inviting me to this very meaningful gathering. I read some parts of the report where I thought I could make some useful remarks, especially with regard to the digital governance area, which I think I will be making my remarks on. As Doug mentioned previously, I have done some previous research on the development of digital trade rules, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. I've been comparing the digital trade rules that have been incorporated in the digital trade agreements that have been developed in the Asia-Pacific region during the past 3 or 4 years. So I think I'll be basing my remarks on those issues. First of all, I'd like to mention some of the key features of China's position as shown by its proposals made in the WTO plurilateral talks on e-commerce, which shows a stark difference between the positions of the US and EU and other Western countries, so-called, versus China. There are 2 provisions that are especially important in liberalizing digital trade, and which are namely the provisions on cross-border data transfer and the prohibition of data localization. They're actually 2 sides of the same coin, because the prohibition of data localization requirements imply that there should be free flow of data across borders without having data centers located in the territory where the services are provided. So while the US and EU may harbor some differences in other areas on digital trade rules, for example, like personal data protection rules, they actually do converge on these two provisions, cross-border data transfer and prohibition of data localization, although US goes a little bit further to provide the prohibition of data localization for financial data as well. But anyway, going back to China, when looking at its proposals, has not included any language that proposes to for the free flow of data or prohibition of data localization, because as the report very well mentions and explains, it goes against its global digital strategy on emphasizing data control within its territory and its national security laws regarding digital strategy. My second point is on the rules that have been developed for digital trade in the Asia-Pacific region. As you may very well know, there has been a proliferation of digital trade agreements during the past 3 or 4 years, starting from the CPTPP, which has a chapter on e-commerce, which was signed in 2018, and the digital trade agreement between the US and Japan, which was signed in 2019. And next, we have the DIPA between Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile, which was signed in 2020, and the DEA between Australia and Chile. The most recently signed digital trade regional agreement, which contains a chapter on e-commerce, is RCEP. And as you all know, China is a member, together with Korea and Japan and other 10 ASEAN countries. This has been signed in 2020, and it has been in force since February this year. Unfortunately, RCEP do contain e-commerce provisions, but they have very low level of commitment regarding liberalization of digital trade. So while there are provisions on cross-border data transfer and the prohibition of data localization, the two important provisions, and they do take the form of being mandatory commitments, they're actually, they have no teeth, because there are 3 types of exceptions provisions that are contained within this chapter, which actually do not bind the RCEP members for implementing those important digital trade related obligations. First of all, there is the LPPO, the so-called legitimate public policy objective exceptions, which allow the RCEP members to not implement the mandatory provisions if they think that they need the trade barriers in order to protect or in order to promote their legitimate public policy objectives. And secondly, there is a security exception, which allows the RCEP members not to follow the commitments if they think that the trade barriers or the regulations that they have in place are necessary to for their essential security interests. And the third loophole is the exception from the dispute settlement mechanism. In other words, there is an explicit provision that does not apply the dispute settlement provisions on the e-commerce chapter. So basically, what this RCEP e-commerce chapter does is they have the mandatory provisions, but all those exceptions provisions allow the RCEP members to not be bound by these mandatory provisions. And now going to Korea, which is also a member of RCEP. I mentioned the very low level of commitments on digital trade liberalization in the RCEP. So recently, Korea has also signed a DPA with Singapore and has officially made its position to join the CPTPP negotiations, which is, I think, good news, because obviously CPTPP has a higher level of commitment levels with regard to digital trade. So the implications of being a party of RCEP together with China in terms of digital trade rules in the Asia-Pacific region, I think are not very positive if we think in terms of liberalizing digital trade, since, as I mentioned, the level of rules for digital trade in RCEP is not very high. And basically, the RCEP members are not bound by any of the rules that prohibit data localization or make the members implement regulations that are necessary for free flow of data. And this means that China is actually free to implement its regulations on data security and personal information protection, which basically emphasize the protection of data security, which is in compliance with their national security strategy. And so, but recently, we all know that China has made public its intention or its ambition to join the CPTPP, which has higher rules for digital trade. But I think that this position or their intention to join the CPTPP comes from a sort of a misunderstanding that although the provisions, the important provisions for digital trade liberalization is there, they can sort of fall back or not be bound by these mandatory obligations due to the exception provisions that are also contained in the CPTPP, namely the LPPPO exceptions and the security exceptions that are contained in the CPTPP as well. So I think that in terms of digital governance, if we're going to work on a workable or an effective digital governance that will be useful for establishing this liberal economic order-based digital architecture in the Asia-Pacific region, we need to work on digital trade rules that are narrow enough or tight enough so that the countries like China cannot misinterpret the exceptions provisions in particular, or interpret them broadly enough so that China may consider that the rules are not tight enough for them to comply with the obligations. And lastly, if I may ask several questions about the report and to the authors on what they think about the issues that I had while reading the report and while doing the research. My first question is, although the report does provide some suggestions or recommendations for dealing with the China issue in digital strategy, how do you suggest that the rules on digital trade should be made, or what kind of provisions do you think should be included in the digital trade agreements so that it may effectively constrain China's attempt to dominate this international digital architecture to its benefit? And my second question is, I'm actually very curious about the US position on the data security, because more specifically, as you all know, there has been rising emphasis or rising importance of economic security issues. In terms of technology, I think this means technology competition between the US and China. And so this issue of security in digital trade and digital economy is free flow of data, or this cross-border transfer of data, still the most important objective for the US in terms of digital trade rules? Because when thinking about the security aspect of data and the need for data liberalization or the cross-border of data for enabling digital trade rules to serve the liberal economic order, what position do you think should we take on security exceptions? Because I mentioned all these issues about security exceptions and LPPO exceptions, and I don't think there is still a coordinated position among the Western countries or countries like Korea, which want to join this infrastructure or a governance system. And I think that the US needs to have a more coordinated or a more structured position so that the countries may follow. That's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you. And those are some great questions. Fortunately, the author of that chapter, Nigel Corey, will be speaking on the next panel. So he'll probably address some of those questions in his remarks, and I've written them down to probably address those on the next panel. But with our last 8 minutes here, I'd like to ask you and Karen a couple of questions as well. So we will get to those in a little while. I'd start with Karen. You mentioned Chinese platforms expanding into critical areas such as media, health, and even energy grids. So if you're a country trying to develop policy responses to this growing influence in your country, how do you go about identifying and prioritizing where the biggest risks lie? Or is there sort of no choice and you just have to address this across the board with broad policies?
One thing I didn't talk about, I talk about it in the report, is a lot of Chinese platforms, the way they're entering these markets is through acquisition. So they're basically, the key investor or the owner of a domestic provider, a domestic e-bank, or, a gaming company, or, a media company. And so, one thing to think about is, what is the country's policy about foreign participation in critical infrastructure? Is it being applied in the digital space or not? Are there provisions that are just being skipped? So for example, it was Tencent in some of their e-bank purchases. They were basically able to inherit e-bank license in Europe. So that those kinds of questions I think are interesting. The other thing I think with regard to what Professor Lee was raising on the trade side is, in addition to cross-border and data localization, what's come up a lot is the whole issue of algorithms and the power of, state control on Chinese platforms, both not just what's collected. A lot of the data localization security is about data that is generated or collected, but what about data that's pushed, that's leveraged and then pushed out? Some things are pushed, some things are withheld. I think that complexity is also there, and China knows the complexity. They added algorithms to their export control catalog when they put out their new export control law, so that they appreciate this. They see it as a point of leverage and as a point of security. So I think it's cross-border, but also if you're dealing with a big, last point is just with a really big platform that can be vertically integrated across national boundaries, what is data localization for a company like that? Those companies might be fine with data localization because they own the data centers throughout a particular region, and that might benefit them. So I think the complexity of what's going on within borders as much as across borders, I think is really important to consider.
Thank you, Karen. And I have a question for you, Professor Lee. When looking at these digital trade agreements, the proliferation of them that you pointed out, and we see both China and Korea expressing interest in joining DIPA, and you mentioned the new RCEP rules taking place. How does Korea view China's role in this? And do you see this as advancing China's digital strategy? And does that come at any cost to Korea? Or does Korea approach this from a sort of competitive standpoint? Or do they welcome China's participation in, say, the DIPA agreement?
Thank you for the question, Doug. As I mentioned previously, China is a member of currently only RCEP, and Korea and Japan are also members together with the developing countries of ASEAN. When only thinking about RCEP in terms of digital trade rules, I don't think it has much of an impact because there are so many exceptions, and I think the reason why China was able to agree to the rules on e-commerce despite its national digital strategy, which actually is not in line with the digital trade rules contained in the DTAs, is because of these loopholes that are contained in the DTAs in RCEP. But its ambition to join, or the attempt to join CPTPP, as I mentioned, also seems to be based on their understanding that the provisions can be are actually not tight enough because of these exceptions, and the way these exceptions have been made is that there's no definition on what security exceptions are and how they can be applied in terms of digital trade. And so because there is no applied law in place, I think that China sort of interprets the CPTPP digital trade rules to be loose enough so for them to join. I think this is bad news for the Asia Pacific region, including Korea and other countries that want to have a very regulated or a good governance system for digital trade. And I think that the efforts that currently being made by the US in terms of talk about the IPEF, which I think has a digital trade area or an arrangement on digital trade that the US is working on or planning to work on. The direction and the rules that need to be established in the IPEF digital trade rules need to consider these ambitions or the misunderstandings that China has with regard to the current digital trade rules. And I think that for countries like Korea, which cannot deal with China one-on-one, and it needs to work with its allies and other partners in the Asia Pacific region in order to deal with China. I think that this multilateral or plurilateral initiative on digital trade rules in the Asian region is very important, and that it actually, although it's only happening in Asia, it sort of serves as a test bed to see whether these governance on digital trade can actually work on against China to constrain their ambitions or their attempts to dominate the next international order, which is being established based on digital architecture. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we only have 1 minute left, but Karen, I did want to throw you a quick question from the audience, if you could give a brief response. They had a follow-up question about Alibaba's global e-trade platform and what the current status of this is and what the implications might be if this continues expanding.
Yeah, I mean, Alibaba is following, it's basically a build out of their logistics hub and their air cargo. They've targeted, a couple key points in Southeast Asia, Europe, and Africa, Middle East. It's still fairly limited in scope, but what's interesting to me is how it has followed government agreements that the Chinese government has negotiated on One Belt, One Road. It's also interesting their interest in cold chain and also their interest in aligning with some of the autonomous driving trucking companies. And so I think this is an example, Emily highlighted this earlier, where you have a lot of nascent activity and it's easy to dismiss it, that this is small, this is only in 6 cities, this type of thing, but that it could develop quite quickly. And the other point is how it's linked to Alibaba's setup in Yiwu domestically. And so there's a lot of government preference and support. And so again, this is an example where when you're looking at Chinese activity overseas in these areas, how does it link back domestically? What is the domestic policy? What's the domestic touch point? And I just wanted, if I could just 10 seconds to say something very briefly on Dr. Lee's question. China, when they joined the WTO, they made a lot of commitments and they abided by, they agreed to a lot of rules. If you look at telecom information technology services, telecom value-added services, financial services, I wonder if there's a risk in some of these agreements that are setting rules. Is China actually going to license foreign providers in China to be able to move into the market? Or is China going to have everybody else follow these rules? Or China might have to follow the rules in third countries, but they're still not going to open their own market. I don't see the provision where China is opening its market to foreign participation. I think this asymmetry persists, and the risk is that countries who follow the rules and the laws could be potentially at a disadvantage if China doesn't, and if China doesn't open further. just to mention that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. That's an interesting point to end on. And thank you both so much for your time. I will now hand it over to my colleague, Allison Zelwinski, for the second panel.
Thanks again, Doug. So I will go ahead and turn it over to our next panel presentations, and I'm excited that we'll have some kind of connection and overlap from the first panel discussion into the second panel, and we'll get to some of those questions that were initially touched on in the first panel as we go along here. So first we will hear from, I think first from Jimbak Choi, who is a research professor at the Center for Chinese Studies at the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security, Korean National Diplomatic Academy. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, and his research area covers China's domestic politics and labor issues. And then we'll hear from Nigel Corey, who is the author in this report and is an associate director at the Information Technology Innovation Foundation, where he focuses on cross-border data flows, data governance, intellectual property, and how they each relate to digital trade and the broader digital economy. He has provided in-person testimony and written submissions and has published reports and op-eds relating to these issues across the globe. Previously, he worked for 8 years in Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So with that, we'll turn it over to our panel. Let's see.
Oh,
there we go.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. It's really great to be here to discuss the Chinese data transfer issue. And of course, I'm not a big expert in this field, but I try to understand these issues in recent period, and it's really great opportunities to share the ideas with other experts in this field. So I'm really happy this morning. So what I want to discuss this morning with all of you is I will focus more on China's domestic political process in terms of the issue we discussed today. Especially, I will discuss about China's recent common prosperity push in terms of how it has an implication for the China's digital economy and the data transfer issue. As all of you already knows about the Chinese government try to push common prosperity issue from the last year, and it is a big policy push under the Xi Jinping because he tried to start his third term presidency in this year. So he want to have a new kind of political initiatives, and common prosperity is the kind of his new brand in terms of policy to get this kind of political process properly work in China. So in China, common prosperity is the catchwords you can see in every place. And as all of you already know, China last year announced it already resolved the issue of absolute poverty issue. So China's economy get improved a lot. So from now on, China will focus more on common prosperity, which sounds like will focus more on redistribute wealth among the people. That is the major kind of policies of common prosperity we can easily understand. But in the policy process, what we found was the Chinese government pushed the common prosperity mainly focused on took put more regulations on China's big tech platform companies. Previously, these kind of Chinese big platform companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu, they were protected by the government to developed in China's domestic market because China prohibited other countries, major big companies doing their business in China, so they can have opportunities to develop. But suddenly, from last year, China, under the name of common prosperity, they put a lot of pressure for China's these big tech platform companies. So it's very interesting. And one of the reasons they push this kind of policies because they think the unlimited development of the capitalism, that is the had some bad outcome for in terms of distribution of the wealth. So they think, they argue that is the major problem. They cause some issue of China's common prosperity issues. So they want to put more pressure on this kind of big companies to gain the goal of common prosperity. And one of their excuse to put this pressure is they push antitrust law because all these big tech companies in China, they had a position of the monopolies because they were protected by the government. And so that is the major China's policy drive we saw from the last year. And you may already saw the news about how it started in China. The Alibabas CEO Marvin, he started his new business, and the fintech group like Ant Group in China, and he tried to try IPO in, but at that time he mentioned about China's very backward financial system. So his company will introduce more advanced financial system. And at the time, he criticized China's system in a subtle way. But this make the Chinese politicians very angry. So from that time, Chinese government put a lot of pressure for many Chinese big tech companies. So from that time, China started put a lot of regulation pressure on these Chinese big tech companies under the title of antitrust law, and put a lot of fines for these companies. And their excuse is China will put a limitation of the expansion of the capital in China to gain the common prosperities. So that is the basic politics going on in China. And from this kind of regulatory pressure on Chinese companies, China also started its new regulatory pressure in terms of data flow issues. And all these China's big tech companies, they had big data out of their businesses. But until now, they mainly maintain their control of the data within their companies. But Chinese government, they started to think this data does not just exclusively owned by these companies, and the government should have some control for this kind of data. So there is a new kind of a regulatory pressure for these issues as well. And we can see this event in the last year's Didi Chuxing, which is Chinese version of Uber system, and they try to public IPO, try the IPO in United States market, and the government, the Chinese government, persuaded those kind of plan and not to IPO, try the IPO in United States, but DD2C didn't listen the government ideas, so they push their IPO in China, and they got the response from the Chinese government. That is, the Chinese government just make the DD2C disappear in Chinese web market. So they could not do their business in China. So after that, they just had to listen the government's order. So from that time, Chinese government try to control their big tech companies' data directly under the government's regulatory system. So that is the basic policies of China nowadays. And after that, China set up a new rule. If there is companies, they have data about their customers, more than 1 million people, then they should have the review process if they want to public offering in other countries' state market. So China started to set up their own rule how the government directly get control the data flow of its big tech finance, big tech platform companies. What I understand from this kind of process is.
Thank you,
Hello?
Dr. Choi. I just want to say, I want to make
Huh?
sure we leave enough time to do a little bit of Q&A. So if you can wrap up a little bit, that'd be great.
Okay, I see. Okay, so what I want to say is not just China want to set up its own ecosystem of digital economy and data flow just within China. Nowadays, we can see the Chinese government want to control their big tech companies' data by themselves. So it put a lot of pressure on its own companies. So we have to think about these kind of issues. And what I understand is China do this kind of policies because they think this is very important for its national security. So according to my understanding from the Korean perspectives, China's policy does not want to get involved in globalized some regulatory governance system. It just want to have its own system. And especially in terms of data, the government will have its direct control system, regardless of its big tech platform companies within China. So that is the basic China's policies. So it's not practical to expect we can set up some global liberalized data flow system in the near future. So maybe we just try to set up the global system except China. That is maybe the practical way to do this. So I would stop here. Yeah, for discussion. Yeah, period.
Thank you very much, Dr. Choi. All right, we'll turn it over to Nigel Corey for his presentation.
All right, annyeonghaseyo. Good morning, good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here. Firstly, thanks to the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security in Korea and the National Bureau of Asian Research for the invitation and helping to arrange today's event. I love it when a panel comes together, given many of the other panelists' remarks relate to what will be the focus of my remarks in terms of digital trade and data governance. And so I'll try and build off of what they've already said, which I in many regards already agree with. What's important for us all to realize here when we're talking about this is that China's effort to play a role in global data governance is nascent and evolving, but increasingly well articulated and prosecuted at all levels, whether it's multilaterally, regionally, or at the country level. In the last 5 years, China's approach has changed for one that was mainly solely internally focused, best defined through the Great Firewall and sort of the various laws and regulations it put in place to control its digital economy, to one that is increasingly engaged externally as they recognize that home defense is increasingly linked to a good offense. In particular, externally, China's global data advocacy took an evolutionary step forward with the 2020 launch of its Global Initiative on Data Security, known as GIDS. China's international data strategy is based on the principle of state and cyber sovereignty, where governments can essentially take what actions they deem necessary. It's essentially about control. China's relatively new cybersecurity law, its personal information protection law, and data security law provide a comprehensive legal foundation for data governance in China. And while these laws do address some legitimate commercial issues, they provide no effective check on the government's ability to access and control data. In analysing China's approach, it's important to highlight that data will naturally flow across borders as part of the global internet, absent artificial barriers and controls, which is what China has been enacting for over 2 decades. China is a world leader in forcing firms to only store data locally within the country's borders, a concept known as data localization, with dozens of laws and regulations where it makes data transfers illegal or prohibitively complicated and costly, such that firms really have no other choice but to keep data locally. China has expanded local data storage and in many cases only local control over data to a growing range of specific data types and services relating to health, genomic, banking, insurance, payment, mapping, and scientific data. But it also requires local data storage requirements for broad categories of data deemed important and strategic. This contrasts with most other countries that accept that responsibility for privacy or cybersecurity or other data-related issues should flow and move with the data wherever it's stored. Now, what's at stake in this battle over data flows and data governance is nothing less than a central feature of the internet, with a significant impact on trade, commerce, and innovation, as a free flow of data is crucial to success in today's data-driven economy, which increasingly depends on how effectively firms can leverage data to generate insights and unlock value. I mean, much of Korea's economic success and its leading firms is increasingly data intensive, but it also has social and political ramifications. And China, while coming to the game late, has not lost out in being late, as it's still a relatively new issue. But how successful China will be depends on whether the United States, Korea, Japan, Singapore, Australia, the European Union, and others are in stepping up their game on countering China's efforts and advocating for alternative measures, agreements, and frameworks that protect the free flow of data and digital trade, as well as a free and open internet. Now, I'll briefly mention a few of the examples of China's evolving approach to international data governance, which I go into more detail in the book chapter. Firstly, China clearly favours multilateral institutions like the UN and the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, as they provide voting powers to governments, thus lending itself to China's focus on state sovereignty. It also makes it easier for China to marginalise the private sector and public advocacy groups. The ITU scales even more readily than the UN as private firms, as ITU sector members have a seat at the table, so China can use its tech firms to also have a vote at the table. China can, as one official put it to me in an interview, flood the zone in ensuring that it has as many participants and proposals in as many forums as possible. This public-private death by 1,000 cuts is a coordinated strategy by China to get its preferred language embedded in the agendas and discussions and documents at the UN and ITU. China and Russia want to use cyber discussions at the UN and the ITU to push a broad agenda, or as one official described it, engage in so-called issue creep around cybercrime and cybersecurity, as they also wanted to cover the broader data, digital economy, and internet governance. For example, in 2019, Huawei officials proposed a new top-down centralized design for internet governance called the new IP, which was mentioned in the question earlier. China used government private sector related ICT projects to build support in Africa and elsewhere for Huawei's new IP proposal. But given the criticism and opposition that its proposal faced, China broke the proposal into pieces to propose in different ITU committees and study groups, thus making it harder for countries that oppose it to track it and respond to each and every element that may not look threatening on their face, but together collectively support China's overarching goal. In terms of bilateral engagement, China is having a growing direct and indirect impact on individual countries' domestic development of data governance policies. For example, you have AliCloud and Tencent Cloud explicitly and publicly advocating for data localization in Indonesia and in India, as they are essentially trying to give themselves a marketing advantage over US and other foreign cloud providers, as policymakers in these countries are sensitive to concerns about having issues about accessing data and security of data. And so these Chinese firms are trying to provide data localization to sort of ensure that they can get the best position with these policymakers and government procurement contracts there. But it goes much further in that Chinese companies are working hand in glove with the Chinese government as it relates to both ICT infrastructure development in Africa, which has essentially been the first wave of Chinese investment in the region, associated obviously with the Belt and Road or the Digital Silk Road there. But while many of these projects have focused on much needed ICT infrastructure, what I think we've started to see is the second wave or this policy evolve increasingly into China and Chinese firms advocating for Chinese-based regulations as it relates to data localization and restrictive content measures online. And we've seen this in Sierra Leone and Tanzania and elsewhere, as governments in these regions are legitimately trying to figure out how best to address these data-related issues, and they're looking around the world for model examples. And when they have the Chinese government and Chinese firms they're already working with them, they're a ready source of advice as to what type of policies they should put in place. In terms of trade negotiations, Professor Lee already touched on many parts of China's approach. But just to recap, until recently, China refused to engage on data-related provisions and digital trade within the context of trade agreements. China has traditionally seen this issue more through the lens of traditional e-commerce in terms of small package trade across borders that involves customs and trade facilitation. It has been extremely reluctant to deal with data as it considers it a sovereignty issue. And so, but that changed with RCEP, where China made its first commitments on data. But as Professor Lee pointed towards, these were essentially meaningless in that they were not binding and they were not enforceable. And so they had no real impact. They definitely didn't have any impact on China or any other country in RCEP. But it raises the question of what would China potentially be willing to do in other negotiations, such as the World Trade Organization's e-commerce negotiations. And so I spoke to negotiators that dealt with China both in RCEP and the WTO. And while China has been constructive in talks at the WTO, they have not had to put language on the table yet. And because data is a sensitive issue that will likely come later in negotiations, China is sitting back and waiting. And at the moment, the focus of this conflict over data is between the United States and Europe. And it's hiding behind them in not having to put language forward. But when it comes forward to putting language, I think getting to Professor Lee's point, what we will see is China will advocate for a broad self-judging exception for national security, because that's what China wants to maintain its plethora of data localization measures, which it sees as being central to its national security. And I'll get into some of the reasons why this is misguided later on. But in terms of recommendations, starting from the top, Korea, the United States, Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Mexico, Canada, and others that support an open rules-based global digital economy need to do much more to develop a detailed and coordinated strategy to identify, map, track, coordinate, and respond to China's various efforts to enact restrictive measures as regards to international data governance. China's ability to be successful for its preferred approach in part depends on an apathetic and passive membership and an uncoordinated response. And so Korea, the United States, and others need to engage across the board at these often bureaucratic, slow-moving and frustrating institutions to ensure that each and every proposal is thoroughly vetted. The Korea and the United States need to up their cyber diplomacy engagement to talk to both each other, but to every other country involved here. Until recently, it's largely been a case where the United States and Russia sort of enter the room late in negotiations and largely shape the outcome. That's no longer the case. China and Russia are playing the full field of countries in trying to build support for the proposals at the UN and the ITU. Korea, the United States, and others need to do the same. When it comes to developing trade law, what Korea and the United States and others need to do is develop nuanced trade law provisions that prohibit the misuse of privacy and national security exceptions. In that, what the United States and Korea need to do is define a narrow scope of rules that allow governments to take very clear but very specific and narrowly targeted restrictive action as it relates to actual legitimate national security concerns, but allow the vast majority of the rest of largely commercial data activity and data flows to take place. And that's directly opposite to China's approach, which defines national security very broadly and thus sort of allows them to intervene in data wherever they see fit. And so the challenge for the United States, Korea, and others is to elaborate on the rules around digital trade and data flows to make them as detailed as possible so that countries like China can't misuse these exceptions to enact broad-based restrictions which affect the core data flows at the heart of the global digital economy. I realize that's going to be very challenging. Many countries have not figured it out domestically yet, but it's a necessary prerequisite to countering China's approach to enacting a control-based approach to data governance. And with that, I'll end it there and look forward to any questions you might have.
Thanks so much, Nigel. We don't have much time here left, but I want to hit just a few questions. We have a few audience questions and then also can tie in a little bit of the remaining carryover from the previous panel. So I'll just kind of pair a few not necessarily related questions here to get them out there and give us a little bit of time for you all to respond before we wrap up here at the end. So first, Nigel, you already touched on and kind of responded to some elements of what Dr. Lee threw out at the very end of the last panel in terms of recommendations for liberal democracies. So the second half of her question, if you wanted to touch on that at all, U.S. position on data security, is free flow of data the top priority? And just expand on any element of that. That would be one area to go to. Hold on, I'll just give you a second on that. And then for both of our speakers, we had an audience question on what are the factors that we could foresee as obstacles for China to achieve its global digital strategy, or specifically the goals of its data governance strategy. And for Dr. Choi, are there some domestic, potential domestic limitations as we look at the tech crackdown in other areas to China's achievement of some of these goals?
No, so to start things off, it will be a challenge for all countries as the United States and other countries are still grappling with domestic cybersecurity and national security arrangements as it relates to data, as is Korea. I was on a panel last week with the Korean trade minister and mentioned that Korea has extraordinarily restrictive, only in the world restrictions on data and cloud services for government services in a way that their only comparator is China. And I just mentioned that to show that Korea, the United States, and others need to develop amongst themselves their own frameworks for managing this issue to provide a contrasting approach to what China does. The best phrase that I know of that typifies this approach is high walls, small gardens, in that governments specify what data is absolutely core and critical to national security and enacting restrictions around that, but doing so very specifically. thus allowing the broader array of commercial data and services to remain unimpeded, and to enact rules that support that. Greater cooperation on privacy, greater cooperation on data protection, greater cooperation between exchanging data for law enforcement, greater cooperation between financial regulatory agencies to exchange and access data, so that together you build out this framework of clear rules that support the free flow of data and ensure that associated legal responsibilities don't impede the movement of data. That hasn't happened yet because there's too many domestic developments in these countries, and then obviously key conflicts between key potentially like-minded partners like the United States and the Europe. But I should also mention, given we're talking with Korea here, Korea is the home of one of the most advanced industries, economies in the world, but has not clearly articulated a detailed global digital or data strategy. It has not committed to the types of rules that we've obviously seen in DEPA and CPTPP. The Korean Trade Minister said to me that he thinks that they're ready to join these, which would be great, because that would send a signal to the world that Korea is buying into this approach. And we need more countries like that, like Korea, to do so, to help build as big a club as possible to provide a framework alternative to China, in which indirectly gets to the point that Jinbak mentioned in terms of like isolating China by building a club of nations who are committed to working together under the same set of rules as it relates to data and digital trade.
Well, regarding the issue about what kind of problems we are facing in terms of data flow in global governance system, I would say the major problem comes from China's understanding of how it can achieve its development. And according to my understanding, China's idea has recently changed into an idea of state capitalism. So state get involved in every aspect of the economy issues that will bring more prosperity for the country. That is basic, their ideas. So they think not just the big tech Chinese companies, they try to get the state-owned enterprise get involved in more in this business. And so they try to get the stock of the big tech private platform companies. So they try to increase the influence of the state in the economy. That is the basic Chinese ideas, and it's really hard to change those kind of ideas. And if China just remain that kind of ideas, it's really hard to develop some global governance system in data free flow. That is my ideas. But I also have a suggestion to the United States friends as well, because if we compare the Trump administration and Biden administration regarding the Chinese policies, I would say Trump administration tried to change China's domestic ideas of state capitalism. But from Biden administration, U.S. government policy changed to make a more strong alliance with other countries and put pressure on China, and instead of just try to change Chinese domestic state capitalism, but it will just compete with China. So that is understandable approaches. But the problem is United States did not decide to join CPTPP. CPTPP is the best way to handle these issues, I think. But United States just hesitated in that field. So I can't understand why just the United States are losing these best opportunities to handle these issues. That is my comments here.
Dr. Choi, I think many of us share your concern and the frustrations in that area. I don't think you would find much disagreement amongst this group. So with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. I wish we could pepper our panelists with a few more questions, but we'll leave it here for this evening or this morning, depending on where you are. And just want to thank all of our audience members, thank our panelists, and of course, thank our partner IFANS for cooperating and putting together this great event with us this evening. So thank you all very much and have a good one.
Very much. Thank you very much.